Hello, welcome everybody to the May 25th meeting of the SMI Community Call. Just a reminder of the CNCF Code of Conduct, a CNCF project, we abide by that. If you're not familiar with that, you can find that on the CNCF GitHub organization. Today, we've got a couple of items on the agenda. Well, one, it's kind of our first meeting in a little while after a bit of a brief hiatus for folks to go to KubeCon and all the various projects that are involved in that. But our first item on the agenda is an update on the CNCF annual review for the project. So I submitted that maybe about 20 days ago, I think GitHub says. And it is on the CNCF steering committee's schedule for June 21st. So we're all good to go as far as that. And hope by June 21st, we'll have that, approved marker and get that merged in. Any questions or comments on the CNCF annual review?
We'll just try to drop the PR link in the notes so that anyone watching this can check it out.
Yep, sounds good. Appreciate that. All right, if there are no other questions or comments, let's get to the next item on our agenda, is Gateway API adoption. So this is something I am very excited about. It's something we've talked about kind of briefly in a couple of different scenarios. And I'm thinking that this is something we want to invest in a bit more holistically. So I've been in lots of conversations from folks from lots of different meshes, and there seems to be a lot of interest in kind of in investigating whether or not Gateway API traffic resources can be used for east-west traffic as well. The SMI's resources are sort of similar to Gateway API's, but I think that Gateway API has a lot of brain trust around it, currently a lot of awesome innovation. And I think it really makes sense for there to be one set of networking APIs for traffic routing Kubernetes. And I think it makes sense for us to invest there. We've already discussed in previous community calls. If you need to see those, they should be on our YouTube page. But we've discussed, replacing HTTP route group and TCP route and UDP route with their Gateway API equivalents. And this would be a bit of an extension of that. So not just replacing them, but coming up with a standard model of sorts for how Gateway API kind of interacts with meshes and east-west traffic. And I've been talking to people from Istio, Cilium Mesh, Linkerd, Kuma, of course, Jared, as a SMI maintainer, reached out to him about Nginx, Mike and you and Nick with Console. And there's everybody I've talked to so far has had at least a little bit of interest in making this happen. So that's very exciting to me. And to give everybody kind of a sense of where my thoughts are, I think this is a really good direction for SMI to end up, to go. I don't think that it's great for the community to have two competing sets of resources. I think it helps everybody if we kind of collapse this. And I think this kind of collaboration between different meshes to kind of unify on the Gateway API is already mirroring what's been done in the industry, like with Envoy Gateway being announced last week at KubeCon. We're just doing that for meshes. And eventually, I love to see this kind of move towards a, once you've got the traffic routing piece filled in by Gateway API, I love to kind of have SMI focus on a policy attachments, a common policy attachment set of patterns for service meshes, also listed in the Gateway API. And that will give us the opportunity to be able to really do one thing and do it well. Whereas SMI currently is trying to do kind of traffic routing and policy, we'll be able to focus on just policy. And I think that kind of sets us up for success with the renewed focus. So that's kind of my spiel at the beginning. When turn over to y'all and see what you think about all of that. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I guess I can start. Yeah, I think that looking towards Gateway API for traffic management is definitely for like use less management. Like I think S2 has already started to explore it. I think there's a lot of potential there. I've heard interest from a representative at Amazon as well. Yeah, it definitely seems to have a lot of the pieces in place. I think that it'll be interesting to kind of explore like how can that be applied to the East-West model? Because like some of the semantics might change or expand a little bit, but I think it's flexible enough base with like a lot of optional things now. It's just like rearranging stuff in a little bit different way. Yeah, I guess the question when you're saying about like narrowing the scope of SMI policy attachment, is that like using the Gateway API policy attachment object, or is there something separate that you had in mind for that?
So my thoughts around policy attachment would be that once we kind of figure out the traffic routing story for East-West Traffic and Gateway API, I think we move to kind of figure out a set of blessed patterns or APIs / resources that implement GEP 713, the policy attachment gateway enhancement proposal. Basically, the idea there is that whatever policy resource is going to implement Gateway API correctly is going to have this, I believe it's target ref for on the policy object. I think that what we do at that point is once we've, using the pattern that we've developed for traffic routing, we leverage that to create a pattern for policy execution, whether that's authorization policy, retries, timeouts, all the classic mesh things. And me personally, I would like to see a set of SMI-esque APIs that mesh providers can either implement or take inspiration from and to interact with Gateway API. But that's down the line. And that's just kind of my initial thoughts on it. Does that answer your question, Mike?
I think so, yes. So like one of the suggested patterns for implementing policy attachment is to use like a vendor prefix for things of like, if you're implementing a policy attachment that is non-standard Gateway API spec, you could do like console.io, whatever, / key name. So something like that, like we could potentially standardize on using like smispec.org / key name or as like a extensible point to like chart patterns that may eventually become upstreamed or just like potential like it seems like a reasonable place to have some flexibility in experimentation and adoption.
So I think there's a couple of key things around this, and I'm broadly around not having any duplication. I think the first thing is, as Mike kind of puts out, is like, how do you know what should go where? That I think the key thing, however, for me is around portability. So there's going to be certain tools which only support certain features, and that's going to be the case with Gateway API and certain ingresses, etc. And it was the case with Gateway API, feed networking ingress v1 and stuff like that. I think the key question is, for whom is SMI targeted? Is it an end user or is it an application developer? Because I think depending on that answer, you have to take a different approach. Now, I think if it's for the end user, then there has to be appetite from the other service meshes, likes of Istio, likes of Linkerd, the likes of Trafic, Kong, etc., to contribute to that and to agree that there will be a standardization around the use of the specification as a kind of a one-fits-all for all service meshes, in the same way as you have Kubernetes deployment, regardless of whether it's GKE cluster, AKS, or like whatever. And I think that's crucial, because otherwise you're creating a spec that ultimately people don't want to use, and
Right.
people will just default to whatever the kind of the native vendor spec is. I think there's a different side to this, and I think there is absolutely huge utility in looking at SMI as an integration specification as opposed to a sort of a direct end user specification. I've brought this up before, that you have tools like Argo, like Flagger, and potentially more, which bring great opportunity to the ecosystem of applications which are developing to service mesh, because they don't need to maintain 25 different integrations for every service mesh that currently exists and the 200,000 which will exist tomorrow. And because what you're doing is you're pushing the responsibility of ownership to the individual mesh providers by saying, look, you maintain your own plugin, and then anybody who wants to use Argo or Flagger for traffic splitting, all they need to do is just make sure it's an SMI compliant specification. Now, you know, Lee Calcote has done some great work around that with Meshery, around trying to kind of build the conformance report for SMI. For SMI to kind of highlight who has what features. And we did the work around the SDK to try and make it really easy for end users to, you don't have to do any of the lifting. You don't have to write any of the controller conversion boilerplate or any of the validation webhook boilerplate or any of that. All you need to do is just write a plugin, leverage the controller SDK, and deal with the difference between SMI YAML and your end product. But I think that's a really important thing that we need to solve, which is a non-technical thing. But I think what I'm conscious of is that there's the potential to do some really great work. We need to encourage people into the fold to, you know, to kind of do that, because the narrower the field, the kind of less likelihood of acceptance, and therefore the less likelihood of a really good thing becoming the greater likelihood of a really great thing becoming unnoticed. And I don't know how to go about that. I think maybe as a kind of, there are you know, there's a lot of people on the SMI maintainers who don't sort of no longer actively contribute. Maybe that needs to be rejuvenated, and we need to have that conversation with people.
Yeah, that you brought up a lot of really good points that I think are crucial to making something like this succeed. I'm going to try to kind of go back and remember a lot of them, but I think when you come to the two directions you mentioned, I completely agree with you as far as the possible utility of something like what we're proposing here. I think that it's possible, and I know there's some, I think it's possible to accomplish both. I think that a common set of standards makes, you know, SMI as an integration spec easier. Even if, you know, depending on the rate of adoption, right, you could have a situation where you've got the set of blessed specs, but one group moving faster than the other, and they want to make their own. I think the difference between what we're talking about now and what kind of the way SMI started, quite frankly, I think the difference is that Gateway API already exists now at this point.
Yeah, but that's fine. But it's a very, you know, it's a very narrow spectrum of the situation. And like, do I think it would be a bad thing if the kind of Kubernetes configuration as a standard, or the various extension points, defined as sort of a common way that we interact with service mesh? I personally don't think it would. I think, you know, it's a very useful thing. For example, if you take like something as simple as a load balancer, you know, the kind of the definition of a load balancer in Kubernetes is like it's very portable. I mean, there are a couple of instances where you need to add an annotation to derive a very sort of specific feature, but for the essence, it's very portable. And for the end user, that's great, because I just need to learn, one thing. So regardless of which application platform I'm targeting, or regardless of what it is, I'm learning kind of Kubernetes, and the onus is on the integrators, in the same way as the onus is currently on the integrators. So I think that's a good thing, but I think it's difficult to achieve, because it would require the likes of Console to kind of basically say, we're going all in on SMI, and the likes of Istio to say we're going in all on SMI. And then you could argue that, well, the SMI spec isn't robust enough as it stands to be able to do that. But because then for your end user, you need to then prepare examples which are both kind of like SMI or both of your own CRDs. The end user is now really confused, because they're like, well, what do I use? Do I use this or do I use that? And ultimately, I think organizations will just stick to what they're something that they can own. So I think that becomes an adoption challenge, because then the end user is just unaware of SMI, because all of they're seeing in their documentation is native configuration. So like that, that's I'm not saying it's unachievable, but I'm sort of saying that in my mind is a barrier. And then I think that's something that over the couple of years is something that's actually happened. So then you look at it from an integration perspective, I think you're on a very different sort of different situation. What it kind of, you're looking at a sort of a SMI as an application programming interface, as opposed to as a user interface. The target audience is smaller. It's different. It ultimately, I think the problems are exactly the same, but I think it's also more palatable to people who are trying to encourage to adopt and to contribute, to kind of say, well, we're not trying to own your IP. We're not asking you to throw away everything that you currently do. We're asking you to provide this application integration space, so that great tools like Argo and Flagger and Flux and all sorts of things can actually, you're making their lives easier and opening up the ecosystem. I think that's an easier sell. I think for new service meshes, if there is a robust specification which covers pretty much all, then it makes absolute sense to adopt SMI as a first-class citizen, as a kind of a well-designed specification, and then to look at supersetting features which don't exist. I think that's a very sensible approach, and something that I would love to see encouraged. But it's the kind of the established.
So yeah, I'll share a little bit of context from what I've seen happening with Gateway API so far, which I think is it pointing towards a promising direction. Is that for one, in terms of established meshes, Istio has indicated that they intend to move to Gateway API spec as their primary interface. So not as an option or an alternative, but as in the first class interface, using extension points as allowed in the spec for additional functionality, but focusing on those objects as the one and will be only at some point in the future way to configure their mesh. And then several other of the projects, like Console API Gateway included, are implementing Gateway API first. So as a native primary interface for configuring the product, and some of them may branch out beyond that, but that having it built into the project as like a first class integration, as opposed to like the kind of the current state of things with SMI, where we have like an intermediary translation layer between the first class constructs and how they're represented in the spec. I think that that's something that like first class integration is going to make it easier to kind of get some of the traction of adoption. And then yeah, in terms of the implementation spec, like we've already seen in Gateway API a few folks from Knative who are excited by the prospect of being able to push some of their mesh specific logic upstream into the spec, and are actively contributing and working with implementations to help push that in a direction that's useful for them.
That's all great, but the key thing is like the gateway, the API spec to whatever the conversion logic is still a translation layer. The key thing for SMI is SMI in that instance has no purpose around. So it's not a situation of SMI adopting gateway API. It's a situation of SMI saying any area of overlap with gateway API we remove from the spec, and what we actually look at as the areas which don't is how they do kind of tie into those resources. So the sort of the identity proposal is it's more about being able to use gateway API as a target for those resources. Like there is absolutely 0 point in creating, for example, inside of the SMI SDK, the ability to consume gateway API spec CRDs to like generate end users, because that's going to be dealt with somewhere else. So I think it's I don't dispute that that's going to happen, and I think that's a good thing that it will happen, but it puts a different focus on how we sort of tackle that.
I think that's kind of what the direction my mind's been going with this. Like to Mike's point, at least what I've seen in the field is kind of this rallying around Gateway API as a common spec. And there, like you mentioned, like I spoke with John from Istio, and he kind of told me the same thing. Like Istio is going to have Gateway API be the primary interface. There is, when you think of something like Cilium Mesh, which is still relatively new, thinking about how they're going to be creating interfaces and things like that. It's likely that they're going to be incentivized to look at something like Gateway API, which already kind of has a domain abstraction of how to think about networking within Kubernetes. And I think it's at that point targeting those users where I think SMI, I think that's where SMI can do, as a project, can do really good work, because, and Mike, tell me if I'm wrong, most of the focus on Gateway API right now is on the ingress use case. Like the spec has space for kind of, hey, a mesh could do this or that, but really nobody's working on that right now. Like really, everybody,
it's entirely out of scope for kind of the current focus of the maintainers that are active right now and the implementations. But like there's interest in it. It's just unexplored.
Right, and I think that's fine. Like I was talking to Rob from Gateway API the other day. Like that's fine. We don't want to I don't think anybody should distract from the great work happening on those ingress use cases involved in the API spec. I think what I'm kind of proposing is, I think SMI can be, for lack of a better term, another arm, a parallel stream of effort toward exploring those use cases, because we've already been doing a lot of that work. Thinking about making a common set of APIs. There's interest from meshes, but they don't really have a good space to congregate. And I think what I'm hoping we can do, I think there's an opportunity here, is to say, hey, if you want to figure out how your mesh fits in Gateway API, so are we. Come to SMI, let's be the umbrella where we work on solving these problems. And to your earlier question, Nick, I think that does change SMI's kind of charter a bit from a translation from from a SMI resource to a mesh specific resource. And instead it's, okay, let's do some trailblazing on how do meshes interact with Gateway API? What stuff does Gateway API need to work to truly work for meshes? Like what's unexplored? And then I think the end result, in my opinion, this is a little bit of a better end result. The end result is meshes support this stuff internally, right? Meshes natively support Gateway API in every sense, and there's no need for a translation layer. There's no need for that extra in between layer of abstraction.
No, there shouldn't be. No, I mean, like, yeah. I think that's, that's fine. I mean, there has never been a sort of a routing capability in inside of Kubernetes before, and V1 network, sort of X networking brings that capability. I think Gateway API is a kind of a use case for ingress is one of many use cases, and I don't think routing is exclusive to north-south, and nor do I think the problems of routing are exclusive to north-south or service mesh. So I mean, things like you mentioned earlier on, like retry, circuit breaking, it's like all of those things, you don't need service mesh to do those. They are common sort of transport reliability patterns that people have been doing for decades. It's something which is easier, I think, to do with a kind of a service mesh, because you've got the capability to kind of do that software-defined network configuration. But you could be doing it with anything really. It's sort of it's just your sort of whatever you're using for your internal routing. Like so I think like I'm 100% in agreement with that. I think there should be inside of Kubernetes a way of commonly describing all routing, be that north-south or east-west. What I think though is that work needs to happen inside of X networking, because I think that's the only place it can, or it happens in agreement as a spin-off with X networking or that group, because otherwise you could be doing work that just doesn't get consumed, doesn't get used, and I'm sort of hesitant to kind of so I think like that's like really worthwhile initiative, and it's something that we should progress with, but like maybe it's a sort of a conversation. I don't know, like SMI is an entity. Yeah, SIG networking. I think originally the Kubernetes resource specification, where all of the various routing CRDs were stored, was actually in X networking. I think it's probably been moved up now. I've not spent too much time looking. But yeah, like I think that's the kind of the way to kind of go, like, because service mesh interface was originally set up as a CNCF project to be a kind of a pattern, or to define a standard. It's not a working group per se, so it changes like a few things around the charter, and I think it would be a crying shame to lose that. But the key thing is to provide value for the community, and to be able to push things forward, and to do so in the best way without the sort of the ego of this project or that project.
Yeah, I know we're at time. Do I need to let any of you go?
I do. I'm afraid, Keith, I do have to bounce because I'm currently burning dinner.
Yes. Well, I want to say I appreciate that context, Nick. Definitely don't want to make little of the original charter of SMI or its goals. I do think that this is something that I agree with you 100% on. This is something that needs to be done in agreement. If we're going to do this, it needs to be on agreement with SIG networking, and figure out kind of what the best, what that model looks like. Is this going to be well received? And that's kind of the action item that I've been taking for this past week or so. I'm hoping to have an update on kind of some initial feasibility next time we meet.
Awesome. Yeah, and I think it's positive, right? Like, I think the key thing is that nothing stays the same, things change. The key thing is to move in the right direction and keep ensuring that things move forward. And ultimately to be able to deliver a better experience for the users and the sort of the Kubernetes ecosystem. That for me is the absolute core of everything that we should try to do.
Absolutely. Well, like I said before, we're at time. We appreciate y'all for being here and anybody who's watching. Our next meeting will be, I don't have a calendar right in front of me, but June 8th will be our next meeting. So looking forward to chatting with folks then. Take care.
Later. Bye.
Okay,
Bye.